Today, I'll be attempting to survive in Project Zomboid in a completely empty field. Without having access to the basic amenities necessary for survival, could I survive a full 30 days? I'll be spawning in with nothing, not even clothes, and my goal is to reach self-sufficiency without leaving the boundaries of the field. I would have to choose my traits very carefully, as this challenge would be impossible without preparing myself accordingly. So with that said, let's get into character creation. And what better person for the job than a literal caveman? He's proficient in using spears, as you might expect, but as he is a caveman, he is completely illiterate. Not only was this perk fitting, but it also gives us a huge boost in points we can spend. And chances are, we're probably not going to be finding many books to read. Other than that, I filled in some general essential traits, as well as outdoorsman. Having this perk would allow us to survive long periods of time without shelter, which as you can imagine is pretty important. And finally, I chose park ranger as my occupation, for its various wilderness buffs. With that out of the way, I could now begin my first day. Spawning in, there was one thing that was immediately apparent to me. The field was, in fact, completely empty. So where do I even begin? How could it be possible to survive off of nothing in Project Zomboid? The secret to success in this challenge relies on a single load-bearing mechanic, foraging. By right-clicking on the ground, we have the option to investigate the area around us, and potentially find some useful items, such as berries, resources, and even weapons and ammunition. With enough luck, we could eventually gather all the necessary items to survive the first night, but foraging alone won't be enough to get us through the entire challenge. It wasn't long before I found my first item, a fallen tree branch, soon followed by a chipped stone. These were the perfect two items to start out with, as by combining them, I could craft my first weapon, a wooden spear. The perfect weapon for a caveman. And now's a good time to go over what makes this challenge truly challenging. Each day at exactly noon, I'll have to defend myself from a horde of zombies that will increase in size exponentially each day. The hordes would start off small, but it wouldn't be long before I would have to kill hundreds of zombies each day just to get by. And thanks to the zombie loot mod, zombies will also occasionally drop some pretty useful items. I only had a few hours before the first horde would invade, so I continued foraging, before I stumbled upon some fresh wild berries. Being hungry actually provides a minor boost to your foraging skills, so I wanted to hold off on eating as long as possible. There was also the fact that there was a 50% chance that these berries were poisonous, so I probably shouldn't eat them. So I continued leveling my foraging skill throughout the day. For whatever reason, insects actually give way more foraging experience than anything else does, so I made it a priority to find as many as possible, turning them into valuable experience, which eventually gave me enough to reach foraging level 2. But soon after, the clock had struck noon, which meant I would now have to fight the first horde. Luckily, the horde was relatively small, only consisting of about 10 zombies. By leading them along a path, I could take them out one at a time. Now that things had started to calm down, I started going through the bodies to see if I could find anything of use to me. I picked up some clothes, military boots, and even some shotgun rounds. With the first horde behind me, I decided to shift focus over to finding a good spot to set up camp. The obvious choice was to build next to the small lake located near the bottom of the field. So after a short walk, I made it to the lake. Conveniently, the lake was also surrounded by some sparse trees, so I could eventually use the lumber to set up a base. But for now, I set up a quick campfire. If I could somehow get my hands on a glass bottle, I could use the campfire to sterilize the water and make it safe to drink. But until then, I would have to risk getting sick every time I was thirsty. For now, I snacked on some various plants I had found while foraging. It was only barely enough to keep me alive, but it would have to do. Now that I had set up a base of operations, I established my priorities. My next focus would be to set up a tent, because without a proper place to sleep, I would be stuck sleeping on the floor, which meant that I would basically always be tired. Setting up a tent would be a tricky process, however. The main component of a tent is a tarp, which was relatively easy to craft. But in order to craft one, I would first have to grind my tailoring up to level 2. The easiest way to level up tailoring in Project Zomboid is to first find a shirt with a lot of holes in it, patch the holes in the shirt, and then rip the shirt apart. So that's exactly what I did. Each repair would only give me a small amount of experience, but since I only needed to gain 1 level, this wouldn't be an issue. Eventually, I ran out of materials, so I'd have to put a pause on the tailoring grind until tomorrow. So I instead decided to grind a different skill: fishing. Fishing was a really effective way to stockpile on food, even at a low level. So if I could gain a few levels in fishing, I would essentially have infinite food. After a few minutes of spearfishing, I managed to catch myself a small sunfish. So that night, I sat by the faint glow of the fire and I snacked on cooked fish, until eventually I was tired enough to sleep on the floor, ending the first day. The next day, I was awoken by the sound of an approaching horde. Since I didn't have a proper place to sleep, that meant that I had slept in until noon, right as the horde had begun approaching. I was now going to have to fight the entire horde at my campsite. But somehow, I was able to slip through the horde and make my way out of the forest. I led them out of the trees the best I could, and I started taking them on one by one. I had just barely scraped by, and I managed to take out all the zombies. But I was gonna have to be a lot more careful if I was gonna survive long term. So I began to loot the bodies, and I managed to find a number of key items that would assist me greatly throughout the coming days. The first of which was a working handgun, complete with a magazine. Collecting enough ammunition would be a challenge, but having a firearm would be essential in the later days of the challenge. I also found some armor upgrades, which is useful for obvious reasons. And finally, I picked up a digital watch. Now, I could set an alarm for myself to go off 1 hour before the horde every day. Oh, and I also found myself a new hat, which turned me from caveman to Discord moderator. Yes! With the horde out of the way, I began to focus on organization. Using a garbage bag I had found while foraging, I stored away all of my most important items. Afterwards, I did some foraging, which had led me to find a large field of dirt. This area was pretty close to my camp, only being a short walk away, and it was the ideal terrain to fight large hordes in. Despite the apparent emptiness of this area, it was rich with forageables. I only expected to find enough food to feed me for the night, but while searching, I had found something I really didn't expect to find. I stumbled upon an empty glass bottle, which was an extremely lucky find. Using this, I could easily purify the lake water, which essentially meant that I had an endless supply of clean water. Once I had finished foraging for the day, I made my way back home and I relit the campfire. I was hoping to purify my first bottle of clean drinking water, but in doing so, I made a really dumb mistake. This was only about the worst thing that could happen to me, because now I had an extremely painful burn on my left arm. Not only that, but I had essentially zero medical supplies. This would end up costing me greatly. I decided to finish up the day by fishing until I had caught myself another meal. This time, I made sure to stay a respectable distance from the fire. The digital watch had done its job and woke me up 1 hour before the horde. The field had been consumed by a dense fog, so it was pretty unlikely that I was going to be able to get any foraging done today. Instead, I focused on crafting extra spears. I was going to be going through a lot of these, so it was essential to always have more than what I needed. Then I made my way to the large empty part of the field, and I prepared myself to fight. The fog would make avoiding zombies extra challenging, as I wouldn't be able to know what direction they were coming from. And then the clock struck noon. I couldn't see any zombies, so I was reliant on sound alone. And I kinda underestimated how difficult fighting zombies in the fog would be. That was until I realized that I was already surrounded. The fog had allowed the zombies to get uncomfortably close, almost ending the run with one single mistake. The fall had also caused my bandage to rip off, and it reopened my burn wound, causing me to bleed out fast. I had to get away from the horde and bandage as soon as possible, which is when I realized that I was all out of bandages. Acting fast, I led the horde far enough away to give me enough time to steal a pair of socks off a zombie. I ripped them into sheets, and I used them to bandage myself up. It wasn't the most sanitary choice, but it was my only option. After I cleared out most of the zombies, the fog had finally started to let up. So then, I began going through the zombie loot. One zombie happened to be carrying a striker shotgun, an immensely powerful weapon for clearing out hordes. hordes. While this was a pretty lucky find, I was going to hold off on using any firearms until I absolutely needed to, since ammunition was an extremely limited resource. Once I had made it back to camp, I spent the rest of my day doing miscellaneous tasks. I leveled up my fishing, foraging, and tailoring skills. At this point, I started to get used to my new lifestyle. I had barely just enough to survive each day, but soon I could start making some real progress. By the time I woke up on day 4, I had about an hour to prepare for the day's horde. I sharpened a few more spears and head out. This time, I greatly refined my zombie killing strategies. By leading the zombies in a straight line, I could take them out quickly and efficiently. I was able to take out the entire horde without any struggle. My spear skills were improving exponentially, and I could easily take out multiple zombies in one stride. After I'd executed the last zombie, I started looting. This time I found an axe, which was a huge upgrade from the stone axes I had been using, and I also picked up a handsaw, which would allow me to cut down logs into planks. So I tucked away my new tools and I head home. I spent the rest of day 4 focusing solely on tailoring. It was a long process, but by day 5, I was eventually able to finally reach tailoring level 2. So, using my new tailoring skills, I was able to set up a tent, which meant that I could finally get a proper night's sleep. I woke up on day 6 with the goal of focusing on my long-term survival. The first step was to build some crates for storage. So I chopped down a few trees, sawed the logs into planks, and built some new crates next to my tent. With that, I finally had some proper storage, so I moved all of my loot over from the garbage bag over into the crates. Fighting off the daily hordes of zombies was starting to become more of a chore than anything. My spear skills had greatly improved since the start of the challenge, but I knew that the horde would eventually outpace my ability to take them on using only spears. I continued stockpiling plenty of ammunition, food, supplies, and pretty much anything I could get my hands on. I also started a small garden next to the campsite. Planting food was an important step for my long-term survival. I spent the entirety of day 7 training my reloading skill. By repeatedly reloading my shotgun, I could train the skill relatively easy. Eventually, I shifted focus over to expanding my base of operations. I started off small, built an extra storage crate, and a dock extending out into the water. Starting on day 8, I began exclusively training my carpentry skill. So, for the next week, that's exactly what I did. I would spend the entire night cutting down trees and sawing the logs into their most basic components. And then when I woke up the next morning, I would spend several hours fighting the day's horde. Surprisingly, fighting off the hundreds of zombies felt relatively easy given the circumstances, but it started taking a really long time. I would often spend multiple hours just fighting zombies and nothing else. The battlefield slowly became littered with long lines of zombie corpses and broken spears. Back at the base, I started putting all the trees I was cutting down to use. I began building a large wall to encompass my campsite, which ended up being a multi-day project. After a few days of construction, I had finished the wall. Given the rate of the growing hordes, I began to run short on time to do anything but kill zombies. There just simply weren't enough hours in the day. In order to give myself more time to train carpentry, I had to resort to more and more desperate means of disposing the undead. I started experimenting. At first, I tried fastening various items to my spears in hopes of making them more effective. The first thing I tried was screwdrivers. This somehow made them even worse than before, as now they only broke in a few hits. Next, I tried using a hunting knife. While this was a pretty significant upgrade, it wasn't sustainable, as the durability was only slightly better than using a normal spear. By day 15, spears were no longer an option. I simply couldn't keep up with the demands of crafting them all. So that's when I decided to bring out the striker. As you expect, it was very effective, and I was able to take out the entire horde in less than 3 hours. But I still wanted to try out other methods. Ammunition wasn't exactly a renewable resource, and I wanted to conserve it as much as possible. So I decided to try out one last method: fire. I used a Molotov cocktail to light the horde of day 18 ablaze. This was undeniably my most effective strategy. The fire spread from zombie to zombie, engulfing the entire field in flames. But there were some obvious risks in using fire this way, because if even one zombie had wandered off into the forest, everything I owned would be burned away. I decided that fire probably wasn't the best option. But regardless, I had bought myself enough time to reach carpentry level 6. I began my biggest construction project yet. I was going to free myself from the burden of combating the daily hordes and end this challenge once and for all. I started off by building a staircase adjacent to the shore, allowing myself to ascend up one level. Then I built out using wood floors towards the center of the lake. Little known fact, Project Zomboid actually takes place in the 1600s, which meant that gravity hadn't been invented yet. We can take advantage of this by destroying the floor behind us, making it so the zombies won't be able to reach us. Then I built myself a small platform in the water, as well as another staircase leading back into the mainland. I built myself a new tent, some storage, a campfire, and even a small garden. Now I was completely safe. And I could basically live here forever. No longer would I have to engage in pointless battles, and instead, I could live out the true male fantasy. Fishing every damn day, brother. Alright fellas, YouTube says that 100% of my viewers are subscribed, so make sure to smash that unsubscribe button.